Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM and UPTV. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I am here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU or UCIMC, or, as we like to say on the televised version of the show, UPTV. These views are our own, and by our in this instance, I mean myself, and whosever's views happens to be embodied in the stuff that I choose to read, if I choose to read something. So, now that we have all the legal stuff out of the way, hello again. And I thought I would start out this program doing something that I haven't done for a while, which is talk about the history of U.S. immigration. It's so easy to get caught up in where we are and where we just were and where we wish we were, and we kind of stay embedded in this middle space between the recent past and the hopeful future. And it's helpful, I think, sometimes to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of where we've been all along and kind of where we maybe are heading sort of by nature or by evolution versus where certain people want us to be or some of us would prefer us to be. So anyway, I looked around a little bit, and this seemed like one of the better ones that I could find. This is entitled U.S. Immigration Timeline. Attitudes and laws around U.S. immigration have vacillated between welcoming and restrictive since the country's beginning. So the United States has long been considered a nation of immigrants. Attitudes toward new immigrants by those who came before have vacillated between welcoming and exclusionary over the years. Thousands of years before Europeans began crossing the vast Atlantic by ship and settling en masse, the first immigrants arrived in North America and the land that would later become the United States. They were Native American ancestors who crossed a narrow spit of land connecting Asia to North America some 20,000 years ago during the last Ice Age. And I feel compelled to mention that Native American histories of themselves differ from this. They don't agree that that's how they came here or how they ended up here or where they came from or whatever. But this is the scientific consensus as to this sort of thing. I would say the 20,000 years ago has been pushed back quite a bit in recent years from discoveries. It's more like 30, 40, 50,000, something like that or beyond, but there's still a lot of discussion about how this worked, how it may have worked, how it actually worked. Who knows? It's a long time ago. We're still finding things out about it, but I've just felt compelled to point it out since on our last episode we were reading Native American perspectives on immigration. It is important to present their point of view on a topic that has long been sort of considered written in stone on one side and completely wrong on the other side. So now you know. Anyway, by the early 1600s, communities of European immigrants dotted the eastern seaboard, including the Spanish in Florida, the British in New England and Virginia, the Dutch in New York, and the Swedes in Delaware. Some, including the Pilgrims and Puritans, came for religious freedom. Many sought greater economic opportunities. Still others, including hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, arrived in America against their will. Below are the events that have shaped the turbulent history of immigration in the United States since its birth. White people of good character granted citizenship. January 1776, Thomas Paine publishes a pamphlet, Common Sense, that argues for American independence. Most colonists consider themselves Britons, but Paine makes the case for a new American. Europe and not England, is the parent country of America. This new world hath been the asylum for the persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of Europe, he writes. March 1790, Congress passes the first law about who should be granted U.S. citizenship. The Naturalization Act of 1790 allows any free white person of good character who has been living in the United States for 2 years or longer to apply for citizenship. Without citizenship, non-white residents are denied basic constitutional protections, including the right to vote, own property, or testify in court. August 1790, the first U.S. Census takes place. The English are the largest ethnic group among the 3.9 million people counted, though nearly 1 in 5 Americans are of African heritage. Then we have the Irish immigrant wave. 1815, peace is reestablished between the United States and Britain after the War of 1812. Immigration from Western Europe turns from a trickle into a gush, which causes a shift in the demographics of the United States. The first major wave of immigration lasts until the Civil War. Between 1820 and 1860, the Irish, many of them Catholic, account for an estimated 1/3 of all immigrants to the United States. Some 5 million German immigrants also come to the U.S., many of them making their way to the Midwest to buy farms or settled in cities including Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. 1819. Many of newcomers arrive sick or dying from their long journey across the Atlantic in cramped conditions. The immigrants overwhelm major port cities, including New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. In response, the United States passes the Steerage Act of 1819, requiring better conditions on ships arriving to the country. The act also calls for ship captains to submit demographic information on passengers, creating the first federal record on the ethnic composition of immigrants to the United States. 1849. America's first anti-immigrant political party, the Know Nothing Party, forms, as a backlash to the increasing number of German and Irish immigrants settling in the United States. 1875. Following the Civil War, some states passed their own immigration laws. In 1875, the Supreme Court declares that it's the responsibility of the federal government to make and enforce immigration laws. 1880. As America begins a rapid period of industrialization and urbanization, a second immigration boom begins. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants arrive. The majority are from Southern, Eastern, and Central Europe, including 4 million Italians and 2 million Jews. Many of them settle in major U.S. cities and work in factories. 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act passes, which bars Chinese immigrants from entering the U.S. beginning in the 1850s. A steady flow of Chinese workers had immigrated to America. They worked in gold mines and garment factories, built railroads, and took agricultural jobs. Anti-Chinese sentiment grew as Chinese laborers became successful in America. Although Chinese immigrants make up only 0.002% of the United States population, white workers blame them for low wages. The 1882 Act is the first in American history to place broad restrictions on certain immigrant groups. We'll see more of this later. 1891. The Immigration Act of 1891 further excludes who can enter the United States, barring the immigration of polygamists, people convicted of certain crimes, and the sick or diseased. The act also created a federal office of immigration to coordinate immigration enforcement and a corps of immigration inspectors stationed at principal ports of entry. Ellis Island opens. January 1892, Ellis Island, the United States' first immigration station, opens in New York Harbor. The first immigrant processed is Annie Moore, a teenager from County Cork in Ireland. more than 12 million immigrants would enter the United States through Ellis Island between 1892 and 1954. 1907, U.S. immigration peaks with 1.3 million people entering the country through Ellis Island alone. Wow. February 1907, amid prejudices in California that an influx of Japanese workers would cost white workers farming jobs and depress wages, the United States and Japan signed the Gentlemen's Agreement. Japan agrees to limit Japanese emigration to the United States to certain categories of business and professional men. In return, President Theodore Roosevelt urges San Francisco to end the segregation of Japanese students from white students in San Francisco schools. 1910, an estimated 3/4 of New York City's population consists of new immigrants and first-generation Americans. 3/4 of New York City's population. New restrictions at the start of World War I. 1917, xenophobia reaches new highs on the eve of America's involvement in World War I. The Immigration Act of 1917 establishes a literary requirement for immigrants entering the country and halts immigration from most Asian countries. May 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924 limits the number of immigrants allowed into the United States yearly through nationality quotas. Under the new quota system, the United States issues immigration visas to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States at the 1890 census. The law favors immigration from Northern and Western European countries. Funny how that works. Just 3 countries, Great Britain, Ireland, and Germany, account for 70% of all available visas. Immigration from Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe was limited. The act completely excludes immigrants from Asia, aside from the Philippines, then an American colony. 1924. In the wake of the numerical limits established by the 1924 law, illegal immigration to the United States increases. The U.S. Border Patrol is established to crack down on illegal immigrants crossing the Mexican and Canadian borders into the United States. Many of these early border crossers were Chinese and other Asian immigrants who had been barred from entering legally. 1942. Labor shortages during World War II prompt the United States and Mexico to form the Bracero program, which allows Mexican agricultural workers to enter the United States temporarily. The program lasts until 1964. 1948. The United States passes the nation's first refugee and resettlement law to deal with the influx of Europeans seeking permanent residence in the United States after World War II. 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act formally ends the exclusion of Asian immigrants to the United States. 1952. It's amazing. Okay. 1956. 57. The United States admits roughly 38,000 immigrants from Hungary after a failed uprising against the Soviets. They were among the first Cold War refugees. The United States would admit over 3 million refugees during the Cold War. 1960 to 62, roughly 14,000 unaccompanied children flee Fidel Castro's Cuba and come to the United States as part of a secret anti-communism program called Operation Peter Pan. 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act overhauls the American immigration system. The act ends the national origin quotas enacted in the 1920s, which favored some racial and ethnic groups over others. 1965. The quota system is replaced with a 7-category preference system, emphasizing family reunification and skilled immigrants. Upon signing the new bill, President Lyndon B. Johnson called the old immigration system un-American and said the new bill would correct a cruel and enduring wrong in the conduct of the American nation. For a while, maybe. Over the next 5 years, immigration from war-torn regions of Asia, including Vietnam and Cambodia, would more than quadruple. Family reunification became a driving force in U.S. immigration. April to October 1980, during the Mariel boat lift, roughly 125,000 Cuban refugees make a dangerous sea crossing in overcrowded boats to arrive on the Florida shore seeking political asylum. 1986, President Ronald Reagan signs into law the Simpson Masoli Act, which grants amnesty to more than 3 million immigrants living illegally in the United States. 2001, U.S. Senators Dick Durbin and Orrin Hatch proposed the first Development, Relief, and Education of Alien Minors, or DREAM Act, which would provide a pathway to legal status for dreamers, undocumented immigrants brought to the United States illegally by their parents as children. The bill and subsequent iterations of it don't pass. 2012, President Barack Obama signs Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, which temporarily shields some dreamers from deportation but doesn't provide a path to citizenship. 2017, the then president, who I will avoid naming, issues 2 executive orders, both titled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States, aimed at curtailing travel and immigration from 6 majority Muslim countries: Chad, Iran, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia, as well as North Korea and Venezuela. Both of these travel bans are challenged in state and federal courts. 2018, the travel restrictions on Chad are lifted. In June 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds a third version of the ban on the remaining 7 countries. So that brings this up to date insofar as that this particular history is written. So notably, you will notice certain things that when there are specific restrictions, except for the very early ones for people who were ill and criminals and whatnot, they're all based on ethnicity. Chinese Exclusion Act, for example. Japanese restrictions, and so on. So it's like whenever we do restrict immigration, it is almost always in terms of ethnicity. So it's something to keep in mind, because it's not like throughout the history of immigration in the U.S., there's this ebb and flow based around working conditions, or we need more workers, so we'll bring more workers in. And, that sort of thing. It's almost always due to somebody saying, oh, it's those guys that are causing our problems here. And then those guys are restricted. And oddly enough, our problems don't seem to get any better when those guys are restricted. It's funny how that works. Anyway, let's see here. So the next thing is, this is an opinion piece from the New York Times entitled Facing Up to the Racist Legacy of America's Immigration Law. So this is going to expand a little bit on some of the points I just started making here. Okay, the searing images of Border Patrol agents on horseback charging at unarmed Haitian men and women shocked many Americans last month, including President Biden. Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, said, quote, he believes the footage and photos are horrific. They don't represent who we are as a country, end quote. Many Democrats made the same argument during the Trump administration, condemning a series of harsh anti-immigrant policies, from the Muslim ban to the separated children from their families, as not who we are and not what America represents. And yet, despite promises made on the campaign trail, the Biden administration has been surprisingly slow to unwind the Trump administration's restrictions on immigration. Mr. Biden has kept the public health law, Title 42, in place, which allows for the swift expulsion of migrants encountered at the U.S.-Mexico border. He has also presided over the lowest number of refugees admitted to the United States since the passage of the Refugee Act in 1980, a total of only 11,445 refugees in the 2021 budget year. The truth is that the mass deportation of non-white people and immigration bans based on nationality, religion, or race are quintessentially American. From the beginning, the United States was built on the dual foundation of open immigration for whites from Northern Europe and racial subordination and exclusion of enslaved people from Africa, Native Americans, and eventually immigrants from other parts of the world. In the years after the Revolutionary War, the fledgling states continued to exploit enslaved people and recruit more free white settlers from Europe. Racial exclusion was first codified in the Naturalization Act of 1790, which restricted citizenship to any alien being a free white person. In the mid-1800s, the gold rush and California statehood opened new migration routes from China, which set off waves of anti-immigrant fears. In words that are echoed by today's Republican Party, Chinese migrants were described as an unarmed invasion force that would replace white Americans, taking away jobs while bringing diseases and drugs. In response, the United States passed the first significant national restrictions on free immigration. The Page Act of 1875 prohibited the entry of Asian women, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred all Chinese immigrants. A cascade of new laws limiting the entry of non-white people to the United States soon followed. President Theodore Roosevelt said that, owing to the low birth rate of whites, the restrictions were necessary to prevent what he termed race suicide. In 1907, he signed the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan that limited the entry of Japanese immigrants. The Immigration Act of 1917 created an Asiatic barred zone that extended from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. The Immigration Act of 1924 further cut the total number of immigrants allowed in each year and made permanent strict quotas in order to favor immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. In addition to immigration bans, there were efforts throughout this period to remove non-white people already living in the country. In 1816, a group of white Americans founded the American Colonization Society to transport freeborn blacks and emancipated slaves to Africa. The Greater Liberia Act of 1939, which failed to pass Congress, proposed the deportation of 12 million African Americans to Liberia. Chinese immigrants across the American West were subjected to violent attacks and run out of towns, forcing many to flee to Mexico and Canada or return to China. Beginning in the late 1800s, immigration line riders known as mounted guards, or Chinese inspectors, rode through border towns checking the documents of Chinese immigrants. The Border Patrol was established in 1924 to enforce the national origin quotas. It was not until the Civil Rights Movement that the United States racist immigration policies came under sustained scrutiny. Although the Naturalization Act of 1870 extended naturalization rights to persons of African descent, the racial citizenship restrictions were not eliminated? That's a new word, I think. Were not eliminated entirely until 1952. The national origin quotas were abolished in 1965. Even then, supporters of the change assured critics that the white character of the country would not be affected. Our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually, Senator Edward M. Kennedy of Massachusetts said that year. The ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Mr. Kennedy's pledge turned out to be wrong. The provisions of the 1965 Act have led to a more diverse immigration to the United States. Yet even as the law has remained in place, politicians on both sides of the aisle have expanded enforcement at the border and increased crackdowns on undocumented immigrants. Donald Trump made anti-immigrant policies a cornerstone of his presidency and, according to a Stanford study, implemented more than 1,000 changes that made it more difficult to immigrate to the United States. Many of the proposals of the Biden campaign suggested a different way forward, even as the administration has not yet followed through. Mr. Biden's immigration plan is floundering in Congress, but he can carry out much of his agenda on his own. He could immediately increase the refugee quota well beyond the current cap of 125,000 and work to ensure all of these spaces are filled. The president can unilaterally expand the use of temporary protected status and parole in place to remove barriers that prevent people already in the United States from applying for green cards. It is troubling that so far Mr. Biden has shown little interest in expanding political capital to rally support for the changes he promised during his campaign. In the longer term, the 75% of Americans who believe the United States is a nation of immigrants need to grapple with the fact that for most of the country's history, its laws meant that only white immigrants could come. From the Chinese Exclusion Act to the Muslim ban, immigration restrictions have been a mechanism for protecting a fleeting vision of a white country. Do Americans still believe we are a nation of immigrants? If we do and truly want to live up to that ideal, then more barriers to immigration should come down, and explicit and implicit racial favoritism of those we do let in must end. Although the anti-immigrant language of the Republican Party and the violence at the border today may make some Americans uncomfortable, this is exactly how America has treated non-white immigrants throughout its history. It is who we are. The question is whether it is who we want to be in the future. So this article evokes the Nation of Immigrants theme that we talked about a couple of episodes ago. It is interesting. The reality of the United States, as it is, not the fictional version or nothing else, is indeed a nation mostly of immigrants, or the children of immigrants, or the descendants of immigrants, or however you want to put it. So in that sense, the U.S. is a nation of immigrants, really. If you think about it, there are certainly Native American people still here. They haven't gone anywhere, despite the best efforts of the U.S. government to get rid of them. But they now represent a very small proportion of the people that actually live here. So it's interesting to look at this history and realize that everyone who comes here, not everyone, but at least the majority of the people that came here have tried very hard to protect their own kind of system, their own social system, their own culture, their own ethnic makeup, all those things from new groups. And then as some new groups assimilated, like Irish, for example, or Italians, who at first were, they wanted to exclude. It's like, you're not part of this club, but they came here anyway, and they kind of looked enough alike and acted enough alike that over time it was like, okay, you're part of the club.